Good afternoon and good morning. Welcome to the Charlie Mike webinar series hosted by the National Veteran Small Business Coalition. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to thank our sponsors, BAA Systems and Philips, for sponsoring this webinar. Thank you for your support. Today's webinar is scheduled for 1 hour and is being recorded. The recording and slides will be ready for all attendees by Monday. If you have any questions, the mics will be open after the presentation. So I am Earl Morgan, the Program Director for the National Veteran Small Business Coalition, and I would like to introduce today's guest speaker, Scott Davidson. He is the Managing Principal and CEO of the GSA Consulting Group, a growing services-able veteran-owned small business that is focused on GSA Schedule Consulting, federal business development strategies, and federal contract compliance support for small and large businesses. He has more than 16 years of professional consulting and contracts management experience supporting federal government contractors. And most importantly, Scott proudly served in the United States Army. Scott, thank you for joining us for Charlie Mike. I will give you the floor.
Thanks, Earl. I appreciate it. I just need to get that ability to present. It's still not showing up there, and then I can start to present.
Okay.
It's black. It's grayed out for whatever reason.
It is. Okay.
Yeah, it's not switching over for me to be able to present.
Okay, let me do this then. I think I have a copy of your slides. Yeah. And I will go ahead and get that up, and I will move the slides for you.
Okay, great.
Okay. Just give me a minute here. And let's give us a moment here. And we be ready to go. Okay. And let me know when you see the slides. Can you see the slides?
I do not.
Oh, that's weird.
There you go. There we go.
Yep.
It disappeared. It was on for like a second.
Let's try it again. Okay, we have someone just joined us.
There you go. There you go. That works. I can see it now.
Okay, great. All right, great.
All right, so if you want to just do a quick advance.
Okay. Okay.
All right, next slide. All right, real quick, who we are. Go back. There we go. Full turkey. No, you're going too fast. Can you go back?
Let me go back one. Okay. I think the system is moving the slides here too fast for us.
Okay. All right, so who we are, GSA Consulting Group. We're a full turnkey government consulting firm. We do focus heavily on GSA schedules. Our pre-award department does about 150 schedules a year for clients. Our post-award support, which is very heavy on complex compliance and risk mitigation strategies, handles everything from low-level compliance to Department of Justice, U.S. Attorney, OIG type audits and operational compliance support. We run the gamut with who we have, all the way from the Fortune 500 down for our clients to 1- and 2-person businesses. As you can see, we kind of run, and we have different partners in the community as well, between the Washington Commanders, the Monumental Sports, etc. Next slide. Okay. It's just the agenda today. We'll go through each one of these. No reason to read off it. So we'll just go ahead and bump to the next one. All right. So let's talk about what is a GSA schedule, what it is now, right? It's evolved over the last couple of years specifically, although it's been around since the 80s. But now, just to make sure we understand what exactly it is. First off, it's no longer called a GSA schedule. It's called a multiple award schedule after the consolidation took place. That you'll hear it referred to as a MAS or a MAS, depending who you speak with, but that's what it's called now. Yes, GSA still runs the vehicle, but they are called MAS, short multiple award schedule. What has happened with the consolidation is very specific, how it's organized. Very specifically that, you have the top level, which is when you see your MAS number. So it's usually, it's going to be GS35F whatever, or 47Q. That's the other series of numbers that could be, but that's what they are now. So when you hear that is when you hear that number, that's your top level. That's actually your MAS schedule number. Then underneath each one of those, they have something called SINs, special identification numbers. Each SIN is very specific, right? So you need to be able to pursue SINs and have them on your schedule in order to make up what the schedule really is. Each SIN is very specifically a scope of work, right? And I'll break it down here. So you have your MAS number, and then you have SINs. You can have as many SINs as you want as long as you qualify for them underneath the requirements, which we're going to get into. But specifically, a SIN number example would be 54151S. That's IT professional services. Another SIN number, 54151 HEAL. That's health IT information professional services. 54151 hacks, that's cyber. There's all these different ones. So that's what you have to look for, is what you fit inside that scope of work. It's your responsibility also, once you get your award, it's very important that you are performing work within the scope of whatever your awarded SINs were and not outside of it. That's, a problem that's been like that for a while, but just to give you an idea. So top level is your MAS number, second level are your SINs, and they're broken down through different scopes of work, and they're always identified by that number. Next slide. Okay. Here's some interesting numbers just from the GSA schedule perspective. This is a 2022 update. $27 billion flowed through the schedules in 2020, right? We obviously, 2021 numbers aren't complete yet, but in 2020, that was just the GSA, that was the MAS. That does not include Alliant 8A stars, Vets 2, et cetera. That's separate. But there was about $30 billion that went through the GSA schedule. 80% of the GSA schedule holders are small businesses, and they represent 60% of the actual sales. So kind of think about how that is broken down. There is a very large amount of small businesses that do a lot of work on the GSA schedule. So out of the 27 billion, 16 billion of it was a small business in 2021. In 2020, 10% of all of the government needs, by the way, that's pretty steady state, were procured through the GSA schedule. So that should tell you exactly, how significant the schedules are. If you think about the 10% of all buy went through the schedules in that fiscal year. In 2021, there were approximately 14,317 MAS contract holders, meaning, vendors for that matter, possess the GSA MAS schedule. And the largest SIN with sales is the one we talked about earlier, SIN 54151S, which is IT professional services, at a total of $5.9 billion in 2021, as compared to cyber, which only had 136 million, and HEAL, which is health IT services, 241 million. So it's a pretty significant bump and change as to what GSA funnels, specifically IT work. Now, listen, there's everything in the world underneath the schedule. They have, business consulting, 541-611. You have all types of law enforcement, storage, everything that in the world that you can think of from a product to a service is on the GSA schedule under a certain SIN. So kind of keep that in mind. But the largest sold item from a service perspective is going to be is IT professional services. So keep that in mind. Another example, which is the second one, SIN 541-611. It sounds like your normal NAICS code, which is management consulting services. That had $3.3 billion run through it in 2020. And then just as a side note, if you don't know this already, and it's important to know this because we'll talk about business development later on, is that 54151S can be used to sell to all state, local, tribal governments under cooperative purchasing program, and so can the law enforcement one. So just as an FYI, so that means you can actually, those are the only two types of services that you could sell to state and local government if it's not a part of disaster recovery, but through cooperative purchasing. And there's actually a pretty good amount. It's a missed market. So if you look at it, there was $131 million alone that was just sold in 2021 to state and local government under 54151S. Something to think about, that if you're not looking at state and local governments, exploiting them through your GSA schedule, you should be, because it's a common use practice. I see it a lot in Texas and Florida, those different types of states, as an FYI. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right. So what does it take to get on a GSA schedule? I'm not going through everything. I'm just going to go through what the top level is, so you kind of gauge where you are. This would take much too long for us to go through what's required. But the most important thing is that you will most likely, well, let me take a step back. Prior to something called Startup Springboard, GSA requires you to have 2 years of corporate experience and complete financial statements from a business perspective. All right, what that means is you have to be in business for at least 2 years and you have to be successful. Why that is that, and it's very important, is that you have to have positive financials. GSA does something called, when you submit your schedule, there's something called a 527 review. 527 review is, there are accountants, actual CPAs that work at GSA, and they will review your financials, and they will determine whether or not you are actually qualified to be able to handle a certain level of business. Now, the rule of thumb is that they put you into a debt to equity ratio calculator, and they will determine whether or not you are, economically feasible to be able to support work. If not, and you continue to move forward, they will do either two things. One, they can reject you and just say, come back when your financials are much better, or you're basically a financially healthy company, or they will send you to something called a COC under the SBA, which is a certificate of competency. I would not recommend that. It's going to take 6 to 8 months, and you will be raked over the coals with regards to personal finances and things of that nature. Highly not recommended is what I'm saying. So to give you a baseline of what you need just from a general's perspective, that's what you need. You need to be in business for at least 2 years, have projects that are completed in those 2 years in your core area, obviously, and that show that you're a functioning business, essentially. Now, recently, GSA did something called a Startup Springboard, where they allow you to come in as a new company. They specifically have done that with regards to a lot of IT work. It is subjective, number one. You're still going to be reviewed. So what they allow you to do is you can use, substitution for the 2 years of corporate experience and projects. You can use professional resumes that are on staff that you have to show, things of that nature, key personnel, substitute for experience, etc. However, financials, you still would have to demonstrate financial responsibility, even though if you don't have 2 years of financial statements, meaning that you would have to have bank letters, lines of credit, things of that nature that shows the demonstration of a business that could handle accounts receivable, let's just say for 90 days. If you win a contract with the federal government, GSA will make the determination. So I would say, unless it's absolutely dire, I would never suggest you to go early. It's just because by the time you're finished, it's going to be a year, as opposed to 3 to 6 months if you do it right and you wait. And there's always a chance you can get rejected because you simply are not ready or a feasible vendor to get on the GSA schedule. So keep that in mind through that evaluation. Next slide. All right. So that was the baseline, right? So that's very simple. It's a rule of thumb. Make sure you're financially healthy and you have at least 2 years of experience. The rest of the stuff, again, it's probably roughly 30 plus documents that have to be filled out from the GSA schedule. And it's constantly changing. So for right now, there's no reason to talk about that, but I will touch on risk mitigation strategies to make sure you're successful on your schedule, which is where we're going now. Next slide. Okay. So first off, this is the most important thing. I don't really care about anything else with the GSA schedule when it comes to forming your schedule, because this is the one thing that could get you in the most trouble and compound as far as an issue over the years. So number one, if you don't know, there's two things in the GSA schedule right now. There is something called the price reduction clause. And the price reduction clause is what protects the government. And it basically states that if you're going to go on the GSA schedule, you must provide equal to or better than, meaning lower, the best commercial rate for whatever labor category that you have on your, that you use as a company. Meaning that if, let's just say you sell an admin assistant, the lowest rate possible at $100 an hour, and you sold it to Northrop Grumman. That's obviously a commercial transaction because it's between you and Northrop Grumman, not you and the federal government. Doesn't matter who the end user of your service is. It's who you invoice is what determines what type of relationship it is. So being a sub to a prime is 100% a commercial relationship. It's been proven out every year when I get the same question by DCA, DCMA, GSA. Every oversight body in the world has always ruled that that is a commercial relationship. Now, if I have sold in the past year an admin assistant for $100 to Northrop Grumman, that is my starting point to offer to GSA, meaning that we will negotiate our rates down when we get to negotiation. But at a minimum, when I put in my pricing, it has to say Northrop Grumman, $100 admin assistant there. And you will then have to negotiate with GSA, which most likely will require you to give a larger discount, to the federal government to make it more appetizing for them to take your business, essentially. Once that's established, this is the important part. So the reason you do that, number one, is if you don't do that, then you basically will go into what they call defective pricing, which could be also considered a false claim, and they could have significant recovery on you if it's ever audited in future years, things of that nature. So I always want to make sure your pricing is accurate. Most people don't realize that there's a lot of nuances in the GSA schedule, specifically that you have to dictate the exact year you examined all your rates and then attest to GSA that your rates are certified, accurate, and true, and that you did indeed provide GSA with the lowest rate during that time frame. If you don't, there are significant civil and criminal penalties that can occur underneath the false claim, to include suspension of debarment, jail, things like that. We've seen it. I work those cases nearly every day. So it's very important that you get it right from the get-go. With that being said, after you establish your rate, that becomes now your floor rate for your commercial sales, and it becomes your ceiling rate for GSA scheduled task order sales. So let's just say same thing. We sold it for $100 to Northrop Grumman. We happen to establish it with GSA on your schedule for $100. At that point going forward, you can never sell that admin assistant for lower than $100 to a commercial customer. If you do, you trigger the price reduction clause, meaning that you now have sold a labor category, rate, service, etc., at a lower rate than you've sold it on the GSA schedule. It's got to be the same type of rate. That's important because once that happens, there's a lot of things that occur with that that have to be monitored. The other part is, like I said, it's the ceiling rate for your GSA scheduled task order, meaning that on any go forward task order underneath the schedule, you can't go higher than that rate either. So always remember floor and ceiling, right? So once you establish the rate commercially, it's now your floor rate at $100, and then it's your ceiling rate at $100 for GSA schedule task orders. And just to give a recent one, this was about, I don't know, a year and a half ago, 2 years, I forgot. CA Technologies recently got hit with a $45 million fine for the price reduction clause. And because they offered rates lower commercially to sub the prime to other vendors, and they never passed on the savings back to GSA because you're required to do so within 15 days of the reduction taking place. You must notify the government and then make the adjustment. With that being said, I do believe, if I'm correct, they are no longer, they've lost their schedule, and they're debarred from ever getting back on the GSA schedule. I'll go check that again, but I thought that's what I saw on the DOJ settlement with regards to that company. Go ahead and hit the next slide. So That's why that's very important. So when you form your pricing, you must know that. Now, a couple things. You have to understand that, cost reimbursable contracts, absolutely automatically excluded. They're not a part of any type of price reduction. So if you're a prime, anything along those lines, you can't use cost reimbursable contracts to substantiate your rates, and you can't use them, to trigger a price reduction, because the rates change constantly and they're not even trackable. Any sale directly to a federal agency will not reduce the price reduction clause. So if you're selling directly to any federal agency, you can discount to 100%. Doesn't matter, right? You can do whatever you want. There's no issue selling directly to federal agencies. And then again, same thing we talked about: sales to state and local government, purchasing under the contract. If you sell it through cooperative purchasing, like we said, the state and local government, and it's through the schedule, you're exempt, so it's fine. If it's not through the schedule, then yes, that is considered a commercial transaction. And then the one that we use a lot, sales that are a result of an error in quotation or billing, that could kind of be a savior for most people. If it happens a lot, it won't be. Then they'll say it's systemic, and they'll say that you're avoiding your responsibility through a regulatory action. Next slide. Okay. So why do I bring that up as a part of the most important thing? So the Office of the Inspector General recently conducted a survey. Not a survey, but data research analysis from OIG findings. And what they found in 2018 is that nearly 80% of all contractors that were audited had incorrect pricing information or price reductions, meaning that they never established their pricing correctly. Now, out of that 80%, GSA recovered money from every one of them. So that should tell you, though, that there's a problem that exists in understanding the complex regulation with regards to how you establish your rates, right? And then the rest of it all talks about how that works. Nobody's CSP, that's your commercial sales practices disclosures, which you must provide to GSA, were accurate. None of them. I believe that was in the 90+% range. That's not good, because GSA requires you to certify that pricing to state that they indeed have the right information, so that GSA can, in good faith, negotiate with you to establish a schedule. It's very important that you understand the pricing component, and whoever does it for you. I see a lot of consultants work. We have to fix, usually when it's too late, when the OIG is in there, because they want to do the fastest way possible to get you through. They don't look at anything, and they just do all commercial customers. There's no research done for the year, and it's a truly misrepresented statement with regards to, with regards to how you establish your pricing. It is very, very important to do that. Part of that is something also, and I'll talk about pricing structure. The biggest issue that happens, that occurs, is that you're required to establish a pricing structure with GSA based upon your actual pricing, how you sell to people. Now, a lot of times consultants will bullshit you and say, oh, this is the best way we can do it. This is what it means. No, it needs to be accurate. There's two types. There's a market pricing and a commercial pricing for your structure. Commercial pricing most likely is found in people who sell product, right? That means that you have a published price list that's forward facing on your website, and everyone can see it, right? And it usually changes on an annual basis, because if you're not the manufacturer, you're a reseller or distributor, and those rates are dictated by the manufacturer, and that's usually on an annual basis. Although recently it changes so much because of inflation, that's a little bit different. But regardless, forward public available price list is considered a commercial price list. If it's not published, we're going to talk about it here in a second, it's most likely market prices. Market prices, or market rates as they call it, very specifically is what you do when you just establish something in a free trade method. Meaning that, hey, Northrop Grumman, I have an admin for $100. Can you use that in a contract? I can use it on this contract. We shake hands, sign a contract. Okay, I've now established that's my market rate for the admin assistant. Now, if you offer admin assistants at lower rates and things like that, that all has to be disclosed, because that's now considered discounting of the same exact thing. If not, you go through your paces, but I just wanted to point out very specifically, that's what's going on. So you have to understand that if you don't have a true commercial price list, whoever you're working with, you do yourself, do not claim you have a commercial price list. It will seriously affect a lot of things. And it also can mean that you already have defective pricing going in because you provided wrong pricing information to the federal government, which could mislead them to making certain negotiation determinations on how you actually work your schedule. Next slide. Okay. I just talked about this, but and this is a little bit more. One thing that sticks out here. So, and this was a big year for them. That's why I put 14 because I specifically remember this. Nearly 40% of contractors did not provide the correct schedule pricing that was equal to or better than its most favored customer. It was a recovery of nearly $80 million for the federal government with penalties for the contractors. So, and here's the scary part. They only looked at, I believe it was around 60 vendors that year. So out of the 60 vendors, 25 of them not only failed it, but they got almost $80 million back from them in penalties. That's why I'm trying to say in the bottom line sentence there, it is a responsibility of the contractor to provide correct pricing to the GSA to establish the basis of award and the correct pricing for your GSA schedule. If you don't, it will be a bad day one day if you become a successful GSA schedule holder. And I always tell people this, if you have no intention of ever selling anything on the GSA schedule and you'll never want to be successful, then you can do what you want. But there will be a day that if you want to be successful and you sell something on there, GSA will absolutely come take a look. Every year, if you do more than 150K in sales, they will come and do something which is a very light touch. It's not an audit, but it's a site visit. And they'll do it on an annual basis. If you breach about 20 million a year in sales, the OIG will then come in and do an audit on you. It's automatic. They'll do a pre-award audit. Or if there's some type of reportable offense, if somebody complains to a whistleblower, you will get something called a post-award OIG audit, which is also significant. Either way, they have ways to remedy. GSA is always tracking its folks, and they do check on a routine basis. Next slide. Okay. So the two biggest things we talk about would be, again, you have to make sure you provide CSP, your CSP and all your commercial correct sales practices disclosed to the GSA. The important thing about that is it's not all bad. If you have a good consultant who can actually go through your sales data and take a look and you talk to that or somebody internally that knows this stuff, you're going to have the ability to capture actual concessions and deviations that will allow you to have a little bit more latitude with regards to how you sell. Meaning that things like if you routinely have these concessions or these deviations that you could disclose accurately to the federal government, then you could have exemptions. Meaning that, I'll give you a perfect example. I've actually in the past have gotten sub to prime work excluded from the price reduction clause. Now that's not an easy thing, but I can argue it and I won that. It's not an automatic. So things like that, if you had that removed, you no longer have to monitor certain things, right? So it's important that somebody knows and looks at how your data really is over a period of time in a year and identifies trends with how you price to clearly show GSA where you need protection. Because what happens is most people who, again, I'll beat up these consultants all day because I have to go fix all their stuff, is that most people will say all commercial customers and no deviations. It's the kiss of death, essentially, right? But I would say 80% of schedules have that scenario, and that's why GSA is such a heavy recovery rate against people, because they don't spend time to read it or they don't research their consultant enough to ask the questions of whether or not this is a good idea, etc. Next slide. All right. Here's the bottom line. Your CSP and all your pricing needs to be set up correctly. If not, 10 years from now, and this is usually the worst part, when you do get an audit because you become a successful vendor, they're going to find all of it, right? Not a site visit. If they, let me just give you from an anecdotal perspective, an operational perspective. If a site visit results in recovery, you got a lot of problems in your organization because they're not very good at what they do. They don't really look in depth. I've sat there on so many calls. I usually do about 2 of these a week with GSA, and flat out shows that there's a problem and they miss it. Like, it's such an obvious thing too. But we're still required by law, because you signed something called a CA letter of intent, that we still have to disclose to the government if they miss it. So that was a change because they realized the government basically puts all the onus back on the vendor to make sure that if there's any wrongdoing, they let us know. So keep that in mind, is that you are required, regardless of whether the IOA misses or not, to disclose. In a lot of cases, they're going to miss it, but if they do find it, it means you have a big problem. But the other thing is that if they don't find it, there's people that come to us after years, like, we don't understand. We were doing great for all these site visits, and now like the OIG is saying that we owe, $5 million. I'm like, because it doesn't mean anything. You didn't pay attention to what they said to you, and it's very clear what the issues are. So keep that in mind. Mandatory disclosure rule is applicable to every government contract, meaning that you cannot overbill the federal government. You cannot make any overpayment to the federal government, for that matter, meaning, to the vendor, meaning that you cannot take money from the federal government if you know it's over what they should be. In this case, a price reduction would be, hey, my GSA rate's 100. I sold it commercially for 95. My rate should be reduced by $5. I then have to multiply that through any active GSA task order for that labor category to determine what the damages are. That money goes back to the federal government. And then they can add all different types of penalties to it, depending on the size and scope. Same thing with unqualified labor. We'll talk about that. Unqualified labor, the other biggest thing right now in GSA world, period, the recovery is tremendous. Very clear minimum requirements. People do not look at what they are for whatever reason. I'm not sure why. And they're getting crushed on these assessments. So just something to think about. The other thing was interesting, nearly 50% of vendors, when there's, when they are surveyed, have no internal controls in place to even be able to tell whether or not they are tripping the price reduction clause or they provided the correct pricing. That's a big problem. I think that number is actually higher. I think people got through it. I think it was some faulty data there, because I could tell you on a daily basis, when I have to do OIG type investigations, I have yet to find a single business that does actually have a robust basis of award monitoring program. Doesn't exist. Like, after we get through it, they do, but it's very few and far between. And the last thing on the best practices I always talk about is you can never forget, being a sub to a prime is absolutely a commercial relationship. And that is where the most damages occur on usually GSA schedule GSA vendors when it comes to price reduction clause. Next slide. Okay, just talked about it for a second. Unqualified labor. This is post war. Bottom line is, you must clearly ensure that you are staffing under the FAR. The FAR is very specific about this too for qualified labor. It's across the board for everything, by the way, not just the GSA schedule, but any work you do for the federal government that's services related, you have to have qualified labor. So just to let me put a little thing there with a nuance, is that if the government is lazy enough, they don't put minimum requirements in their RFQ or RFP, whatever, that's on them, right? If they don't distinguish and say, these are the things we need at a minimum, that's fine. You can't be held responsible for that. Most of the time they do. And you must absolutely ensure that whenever you put out a job rec and the person's hired, that they meet those minimum requirements very clearly. The other biggest issue that we run into is that if you sell anything firm fixed price, this is GSA specific, you must have a basis of estimate for every firm fixed price order you put in, showing very clearly how you mapped your GSA schedule labor categories to the position and who is billing into what. Doesn't matter if it's not T&M, if it's firm fixed price, you must always have a basis of estimate. GSA, the first thing they ask for is firm fixed price. Let me see the basis of estimate. They will even do that in commercial. When they do commercial checks for your basis of award, they will actually ask for basis of estimates for your firm fixed price contracts. So be aware of that. The GSA is a little bit of a different animal with regards to when they're monitoring certain things. I've seen recovery done on firm fixed price task orders very clearly from GSA, from the OIG. So you're not exempt from that position. The only thing that exempts you will always be cost reimbursable contract works. Next slide. Okay. This is just, again, more unqualified labor issues. I usually say, and you're going to get a copy of this, I don't need to read off the thing, but bottom line, two things. You just need to have good process in place. You need to have good, well-trained people that understand. And usually, I'll tell you right now, where the biggest disconnect always is, especially in a corporate investigation, we always find is the same. The breakdown occurs between when what you put in the proposal, when it's awarded, and when that handoff comes off for the job rec to hire on that win. The HR folks or the recruiters never get the right information. So it's not their fault, right? But it's whoever generates that, it's got to match what's inside that proposal. And a lot of times it doesn't, or they're missing certain information, and that's always the biggest failure. And that's what then sets it forward, because then nothing's ever right and they have unqualified people. So keep in mind that when you should have a good internal control and a robust holding spot for your human resources and your recruiting, because, and that's again, not for GSA, it's for everything. I mean, if you look at T4NG, they have minimum requirements. Oasis, minimum requirements. All these different vehicles, and even some of the RFQs, just standalone, not under 90 IQ, all have very specific minimum labor category requirements. It's very important. And like I said, unqualified labor being sold to the government will fall under the mandatory disclosure rule and be a false claim. So you have to keep that in mind. And if you know about it and don't fix it, it then becomes deliberate, which also could become a criminal act and not a civil penalty. So keep that in mind as well. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about some best. We already touched on this a little bit, but your best practices, ceiling rates. Remember, you cannot go above your ceiling rate. One of the most common mistakes I see is that if you don't have automatic escalation built into your GSA schedule during your proposal, you cannot exceed that rate. So I see a lot of people that put a fixed escalation onto their rates, even though they don't have it, and then it just goes over, and that's an immediate overcharge. You just owe all that money right back to the federal government for the entire time you build. So keep that in mind, is that you can't break that ceiling rate. Now, if you have automatic escalation, absolutely, then you follow the path as you go. But some people do not have that, and they make this mistake all the time, and then they have to pay for it pretty significantly, especially for the out years in their bid. The other thing we just talked about real quick that people don't really know about, non-schedule items. You have to ensure that, and again, that's a much different class because it's too nuanced here. We would need 5 hours to talk about all this. But always realize that if it's not on your, the rule of thumb should be, if it's not on your GSA schedule, you got to be very careful in what you do with it, right? You have limits, meaning that you could do something called an order level material for any ancillary services supplied that are not on your schedule, but you can never exceed 33 1/3% of the total revenue on the task order. Or you could do micro purchase threshold, now $10,000, it used to be $3,000, but you could do non-schedule items, but you cannot exceed $10,000. So those are the two things, just again, rule of thumb. If it's not on something that's on your awarded GSA schedule, you got to be very careful if you can even sell it. Next slide. Okay. Okay, we'll do one more. Next slide. Okay, well, yeah, we'll do next slide. These are all things that we kind of touched on, just goes into a little more detail. All right. So let's go into best practices and teaming approaches for GSA MAS. All right, go ahead. Next slide. Okay. I want to kind of give you some data from 12 federal agency spendings with regards to very specific things from 2021. Now, looking at them, breaking it down, we noticed that a lot, this is just looking at an effort perspective, right? We saw that 5 of the 12 top spending agencies failed to meet women-owned small business goals, right? This is just an example as to how you identify opportunity. Then you look at other ones where, a small disadvantaged business, 8As, they missed their goal. This is what's important, like when you look at certain things, is that your research should dictate where the failures are. So most people are going to look for what's the VOSB and the service stable veteran-owned small business. Now, some agencies meet, absolutely, a lot of them don't. So you got to keep in mind of where you want to focus your attention to when it comes to business development. And I would always hone in on ones that don't have a good rate. It just allows you to get in from a socioeconomic perspective. So kind of keep that in mind. Real quick, also, IT and engineering services were the #1 3 services sold out of the top 5 in that year. Next slide. All right, I want to show you a couple of things. So when we look at how it works, look over at the SDV. I use this as an example. If we look at service stable veteran small business, 3%, like goals switch, right? Look at Department of Energy, 0.65. They didn't even come close to their goal. So look at these things. Obviously, Department of Veterans Affairs, fantastic. They should be, but even look at NASA. Look at the spend they have, not even 1%, right? Look at Department of Health and Human Services, 1.5%, and then go down the line. And then agency USAID, 1.19%. Really interesting stuff, right? So you can look at some of the dashboard stuff and you see, regardless of what they say, there's a lot of opportunity for veteran-owned small businesses. And so keep that in mind as you look out in the world as a potential way to start to identify how you can break into certain markets. Next slide. Yeah, real quick. This is Department of Defense small business contracts breakdown for 2021. Take a quick look here. If you look at how the breakdown is, I think it's up a couple of things. Look at this top states by vendor location, Virginia and Maryland. No surprise there because we're in the hub, just so everybody understands that. California, of course, because of all the shipyards and all the Silicon Valley spending, that makes sense. But take a look at how much it dwarfs. Virginia dwarfs California when it comes to vendor location, when it comes to actually how they're selling. Top two ways to sell: engineering technical services, $4 billion, and then ADP telecommunications sector, $1.6 billion. And then you see $1.5 billion for program services, etc. And then choice, a contract of choice, firm fixed price, obviously, right? Government's very adverse to risk, and look at the difference between that and firm fixed price. $43 billion compared to $9 billion compared to, time and materials at $603 million. So it's very interesting to see how that works, just as an FYI. Next slide. Talked about it. Just recognize the disparity between the firm fixed price types, because if that's what you have to do, you have to know most of the time you're not getting labor hour. Always do targeting opportunities and goals where they're not being reached. That's a good segue into the agency. And then focus on the location of the most dollars being spent. Obviously, DC area, is where that money is. Look for service related issues, etc. Next slide. All right. So we're talking about teaming, and I'm watching the clock. We only got a couple more minutes. So and this is after the fact. One of the biggest things that I think is underutilized is CTAs with the GSA schedule. A CTA is very specific only to GSA schedules. Now, there is a CTA in the FAR, but there's two different meanings of how it is, right? There's actually a contract teaming agreement, and then there's a contract teaming arrangement. You have to understand the differences between the two. Contract teaming arrangement, you can see the bullets here. The most important thing is that if you want to form a total solution, you can do a CTA when you're pursuing a GSA schedule. Now, a GSA schedule opportunity, excuse me. What you have to keep in mind, every member must have a GSA schedule if you're going to do a CTA together. That's number one. Number two, the difference with that is each team member has privilege of contract with the government. You all become primes essentially in a CTA on the GSA schedule, but you do choose team leads and team members. So it changes from sub to prime to team leads to team members at that point. Team lead would then have certain responsibilities more over the team members, and that's dictated in the CTA itself. You write everybody's responsibility, they agree to it, you sign it, and you must always submit that CTA with any proposal you have. Everybody must use their own GSA schedule rates to bid it. So if there's 15 positions in the three of you, and you decide we each get 5, then you map it to 5 different ones, and it's going to show very clearly in your price proposal whose labor category came from whose schedule, etc. So keep that in mind. The other thing is you are responsible to pay your IFF on it, right? So you must ensure that you have a mechanism on who is reporting what internally and how all of your invoicing is done, etc. inside that CTA. Next slide. So we talk about this. I want to give a quick breakdown. Prime contractor, very clearly, sub to sub. The BPA task order is only to the prime. You do not get credit as a sub. You just get money and some past performance. You are not the prime. Next slide. With a CTA, it's different. CTA requires the teaming agreement, right? And the teaming arrangement for that matter. What happens here under the CTA is everybody gets prime credit for the work being done, right? So keep that in mind, is that this is all prime credit for what you're doing, meaning that there's now team leads. Now you can actually have subs, right? In a lot of cases, we see that even on CTAs, team members will sub to one another to get certain positions that they need because they don't have a good rate or things like that. So kind of keep that in mind, how that breakdown is. But that right there is a good example of how it would work in a CTA environment with the GSA schedule compared to subcontracting. Next slide. All right, some fine points. We kind of hit on this. Understand it's not a separate legal entity. It acts like a joint venture, but it's not. Right? Everything. It's the CTA is a living document, and you got to ensure that all of the responsibilities for each party is listed, signed, and agreed upon in that document. Remember, everybody has to use their own GSA schedule rates. You must have a schedule rate. If it's a set aside that you're pursuing, everybody must be the same socioeconomic status. So if it's an 8A set aside and you want to CTA with each other, everybody has to have an 8A. Everybody has to be an 8A in order to bid on it. Just keep that in mind. And then let me see what else is important off this slide. No, and always keep in mind very specifically that everything's mapped correctly and that everybody tracks their IFF and pays properly. Next slide. Okay. So the document itself, right? So number one, I highlight it because it's one of the things that you must know. Your CTA agreement is solely between the members of the CTA. However, nothing can ever override or conflict with the schedule terms and conditions. So keep that in mind and see, you know, what exactly where we are, you know, where you are. You can, so I'll give you an example of what that means. If your GSA schedule says you have a, let's just say, you map an admin assistant into a position, and it requires you to have a bachelor's and 4 years of experience, but you map it into a requirement on the CTA that you're pursuing, this task order, that says that they only need a bachelor's and 2. You can never take away from the schedule. You can always add on. So no matter what, the minimum requirements can never be reduced by an agency. An agency cannot waive them. It's impossible to do that. So that's why GSA provides oversight of every contract, is because the agency itself does not allow you to do that. So to kind of keep that in mind. Inside the document itself, always have to identify the parties. You must very clearly identify who's a member and who's the team lead. You then also have to give every activity with all their responsibilities, who reports IFF, who submits this, who talks to the customer, all those things must be in there. You also give type and duration of agreement, all the other terms and conditions inside there, which basically is you're flowing down your GSA schedule terms and conditions, any ordering procedure that's required, and then how you're going to do pricing, invoicing, and payments, warranty, reporting of sales, etc. That's the document highlights. Next slide. Okay, we'll go to leveraging your S for GovCon success. Next slide. Let's set targets. Okay, so you got to look at different things. I talked about it earlier. State opportunities are great with just being not even just from a GSA schedule, just from a veteran perspective, right? I added this because it was a part of what I was asked to add. So out of 50 states, 24 states do not recognize VOSBs or service stable veteran-owned small businesses as a preference category. Just so take a look at that very specifically with regards if you're going to do state levels. Go to the next slide. Okay. Here's some examples of benefits if you go after and want to register at the state to pursue work. Texas, you qualify for hub zone status. Florida, you get preferential treatment under certified business enterprise. Kansas, same thing. Maryland, very clearly, you can be preference under any small business program. Virginia, you do qualify for SWAM, small woman and minority designation. Arkansas, service stable veteran owned, get MBE designations. You can qualify that way. Same thing with Oregon. And then you can see what they are. And then Pennsylvania. These are examples. I suggest you look at your own state, wherever you reside, and explore it, because it's an opportunity for more benefits for, to bid. Next slide. There's only 5 states, which is sad, but we're growing, that have specific veteran-owned and service-stable veteran-owned small business programs, meaning that they're very specifically named veteran-owned business programs. Right? It's not like you're an MBE or something along those lines. Illinois has the Veteran to Entrepreneur Program, Louisiana, Texas, Utah, right, And then New York. New York is 2014 actually worked on the legislation, and it is the most robust in the country. The state of New York has a requirement to 6% of all its government contracting in the state must go to service-stable, veteran-owned small businesses.
Oh, look like we lost him.
Nope, sorry about
Just
that. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. So then take a look at the different cities. So this now becomes a city. Cities are different than states, right? So we learned about state rights, and then cities are different. Cities have different things. Chicago, Nashville, Orange County, Florida, Las Vegas, Cook County, Pittsburgh, Michigan, San Antonio. So that's what I always tell people, drill down to another level. Don't look at the state level all the time. You can, but take advantage of the city level too. Good programs are out there. Even look at like San Antonio, for that matter. I mean, they have, they give you certain preference and points to certain things. So I always like to tell people, absolutely, not only look at the state, look at the city. Next slide. Okay. So this is kind of getting to like some basic stuff though, but I wanted to end on it. One of the most important things when it comes to really having a good partnership and growing, if you're just getting into let's say the government space, you're not going to be a prime right away. Never going to happen. I think that's the biggest misconception, even for these large commercial businesses that I have to deal with all the time that want to get in right away. You got to understand that you're going to have to sub for a while, right? But you got to be very clear on how you're going to do it. Your biggest thing is, singles and doubles at the sub level for a couple of years, and then you can establish a good presence in the market. But the biggest issue that you have out there, you got to understand, make sure that everybody understands like you're a good fit. I know people are going to knock on it. You're supposed to be knocking on every door and trying to work with everybody, but I've seen disasters occur because things aren't written out well. You don't understand the process. You don't take time to read the contract, things like that. You got to make sure that it's mutual between whoever you're working with. If not, it's just going to be a bad experience, and you're never going to succeed in that particular game. So you always got to make sure that all items and terms and conditions are in that teaming agreement, subcontractor agreement, and that it's fair and reasonable. Don't just take things because I've seen them become disasters. If you just, I need to work, I don't care what it is. Not a good approach. Like desperation will breed absolute failure, essentially. Make sure that both companies are always aware of subcontracting limitations for any specific opportunity. I think everybody knows the law for limitation on subcontracting. Just make sure that's a common thing that they know. A lot of people that we've seen in the past, a lot of these large businesses want to run the front part of it. They offer no value whatsoever. They just have certain infrastructure that can be used, but they don't benefit. And that it literally becomes a very strict path through vice versa, right? They just want to use you for your status. They're doing 90% of the work. You're doing 10% for really doing nothing. You will get a lot of trouble for things like that. Make sure you're watching that. Always reach out to any small business liaison officer at every large business out there. Get an idea who you want to work with. Get the list of the links at the page, things like that. Make sure you do that. And always have a solid capability statement presentation ready to provide, and a good website that's up to date and accurate so that they actually know you're legitimate and that they can tie things out pretty quickly. Next slide. All right, so core teaming issues for service-stable, veteran-owned small businesses. Always leverage, so lack of response from any large business government agency, right? I know that people are like, oh, we email, we don't get anything. Yeah, that's great. You got to find a different way in, right? Use your relationships. Make sure, nowadays we can do this, COVID's up, so make sure you're definitely going to conferences and in networking piece, but you got to be looking for active networking opportunity. Industry days, things of that nature, they exist now. But it's the only way you're really going to get touch points inside those organizations and a response. Everyone says the same thing. Everybody else wins, and we have the same set of skills, if not better, right? Biggest mistake. I get it. Look at yourself. Why did you lose, right? Always request a debrief. See what the issues were. And then, again, start looking at better teaming opportunities, better partners, and how you can tweak things. Everybody doesn't want to take responsibility for failure, and they just blame everybody else for themselves a lot. You can't. You got to make sure you're looking at yourself. don't look for handouts from large businesses, small business partners. They'll smell it from a mile away. They'll never use you again. It's one thing that drives me nuts when I talk to people. It doesn't work. When you go there, though, bring an opportunity first. If you have something tangible that's real, that's what you should lead with. Because if they see that, it shows good faith. Even if it's a small piece of work, they're going to want to be a part of you. So make sure you don't go empty-handed to some of these things. Always have something where you do your research and you're ready that you can bring to them that's an opportunity. And then always remember, strategically is more important long-term. One and done, no one's going to care. They're not going to work with you, and the deal is going to be terrible. Next slide. All right, so we're getting really close to time. So how are you, I always ask this question: how are you different from all other service-stable veteran small businesses that have contacted that large business or vendor? That's just a question. You got to fill in the blank there, right? But what are your discriminators, right? Take your egos out. What are you better at? Client relationship. Is it real? Everybody thinks they have best friends with somebody. Every time someone tells me they got a lock on something, I know it's bullshit. It doesn't happen. I want to see something tangible that shows that's real. Make sure you have a specialization in specific areas of business. Show why you're better and that you have the resource and context. And remember, always strategically seek partnerships, right? I will tell you right now, more than anything else, in this last 18 months after COVID hit, we have done more joint venture activity for companies than any other time I remember. And it's people adapting to the marketplace, looking for better opportunities and forming as much as they can within regulation in order to go out and win. So you really need to find good partners through a dating process before you just jump into things, because it pays off in dividends as we start to compete in these different markets. Next slide. Core company capabilities. Again, how do you present yourself to others? Website capabilities, social media. And then everyone checks it. Don't think they don't. One of the first things we do on new clients is we go right to their website, especially if you're being audited. We want to see if there's anything out there that stands out. We'll go to your social media. We'll look at everything. We have a program that runs and scrapes all that. We're looking at things right away. So does most of your government clients and other people you contact with. Always make sure that you show past performance and experience. Show if you want to team with someone, make sure you have a teaming strategy ahead of time and that you demonstrate the very clear benefits of why they should team with you. What do you bring to the table, essentially? Next slide. All right. Right on the money, 2:00. So what question? I was looking at the time and I was pushing. What questions do we have before we have to sign off?
All right. Let me open up the mics for everybody, and which I did. And so everybody can ask away.
Scott, let me ask you a quick question. What are your thoughts on the changes that are taking place with certification as it relates to these contracts, the GSA MAS contracts? How big an impact do you think it'll have, and what should SDVOSBs be prepared to do to adapt to the new certification environment?
Well, listen, here's the reality. In 45 days, it becomes real for everybody, right? In 45 days, SBA is going to, unless Scott, tell me something's changed, but in 45 days, the SBA takes over our CVE certification, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And so we know what happens. If you're not certified within the process, within that year, I believe you start to lose contracts, or you lose your, not contract, but you lose your verification status, etc. So you need to get on it, because this will affect MAS, right? Because here's why. Remember, anything on your MAS is pulled from SAM, right? So your socioeconomic statuses, your task orders, things like that. So if you have set-asides, it's going to grossly affect you. You need to be certified under the new system. If you don't, just like everybody else, as you saw, Scott, like you talked about with regards to Oasis and all these other vehicles, you're going to be left out in the cold. You're going to lose the opportunity, and you're going to get decertified, and you're probably going to get your contract terminated too. Not your MAS, but any task order you have under that was a potential set-aside.
Good.
So everybody needs to, I don't know why it's not more widespread, Scott. We had that webinar we did a while back here. I have no idea why people are waiting, but the shock that they're going to face in 45 days is going to be pretty significant.
Going to be substantial.
Oh, and let me tell you something. So there are people watching it though, because right now as we speak, we have a large uptick on CVE research that we're doing for a lot of people, and everybody else to get in before it swaps, so they buy themselves some time on the back end of it. We're watching that as we occur. So I have people that never have had a CVE certification before in the recent months have come to me and said, we need to get on as soon as possible. And I'm like, well, your date, must be, and we got them all in before October 1st. And now we're going through all the certification, the verification, and the detailed letters of explanation. But no. Some people are strategically planning for the whole thing, and some people are absolutely not. And they're going to be caught very flat-footed in about 45 days.
Good. Second question, real quick. So historically, back in the good old days of GSA IT 70 and MOBIS and all that, GSA schedules were sort of the entry level contract that was available to an early phase small business, any kind of small business. Have the changes and consolidation in the schedules going to the MAS format, has that changed that, or are GSA contracts still a good place for small businesses to look at as their first contract vehicle?
So I had it in the earlier slide, and that was probably the most important thing. And the statistic that comes out of that, which is still the same, it doesn't really change, which I also thought was kind of interesting over the years. I expected to move around. It hasn't. The statistic is very clear. 80% of GSA schedule holders are small businesses who represent 60% of the sales of the nearly $28 billion. So over, what is that? So 28. So about 20, what is that? About 16 to 18 billion dollars of the GSA schedule sales each year are directly at small businesses. You should. And GSA is given the opportunity to get in there too. So it should be absolutely your first vehicle, because it's as far as like becoming qualified for it, it's the easiest way, because you're not measured. Like there's no, like the score sheet doesn't exist like an Oasis, like where it's a point system, right? Where I got to have, we better have, you got to be doing $10 million on this project and this many people.
Right.
Work. That doesn't exist, right? Yes, you have to have project work, and it doesn't have to be, I have people qualify, they got projects that are 30K, right? And they qualify for it because they clearly do that scope of work, like IT professional services. I have a company that does, they're doing all singles, but they're a brand new business and they're growing. But when I used their project, the project was 30K. That was it. But it demonstrated very clearly in the statement of work that it meets the criteria for that SIN. So that's why I'd say you have an opportunity. It's better to have a schedule and not need one than need a schedule and not have one in this world.
Good. Excellent information. Thank you, Mr. Davidson.
No, thank you for having me. I appreciate it, everybody. And let me know everything else. And I'm eyeing January 1st because I don't know what's going to happen.
Great. Antonio, you have any questions? Here's your last chance. Okay, no questions from Antonio. Well, Scott, it's been a pleasure seeing you again. It's been so long. Thank you so much for all this information. This has been helpful. And to everybody who's watching this, if you have any questions for Scott, there's information on the screen. And until then, I'll see you at the next Charlie Mike. Take care, everybody.
Take care. Have a great day.
All right.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Take care.